Rest in peace, LG. It's been a fun ride. As many of you know, LG has decided to disband its mobile division and leave the smartphone business altogether. After years of losing profits and losing money, LG has decided to cut its mobile division, which means we will no longer be seeing LG phones for the time being anyway. There was a time when you paid attention to three companies, particularly at MWC. They were Samsung, HTC, and of course LG. And you paid attention to them because you wanted to see what their next flagship smartphone was, you wanted to see what their specs were, and all of that. However, HTC was bought out by Google, but we're going to talk about LG because LG is the ones that are going to be disappearing off the cell phone map. But before we get into the history of LG and Android, particularly with their flagships, let me go over a little bit of history with me and LG smartphones, or LG phones in general. My first cell phone was the LG Flare on Virgin Mobile. It was nothing more than your clamshell flip phone. You just opened it, closed it, had all the typical flip phone buttons, whatever. But then I owned the LG Optimus Elite back in 2012. That was my first ever Android phone, and it had less than a gig of onboard storage and much less RAM than you would see today, and you could not use it today with today's apps. However, I upgraded in 2013 to the LG Optimus F3. Now that had about 1.2 gigs of onboard storage, less than a gig of RAM, obviously. It ran Android Jelly Bean at the time, and that was my second smartphone, my second Android phone. However, fast forward to 2015, and then I owned this. This right here is the LG G3. I owned it on Boost Mobile because at the time Boost Mobile would, I guess, buy up LG phones and they would load their software onto it, and I would buy a Boost Mobile LG G3. So it had 32 gigs of onboard storage, 3 gigs of RAM. So I bought that, and that was my last LG phone. And by the looks of it, that's gonna be my last LG phone ever. So now finally, let's dive into LG's history with Android. Their first flagship phone was known as the LG Optimus G. It had 32 gigs of onboard storage, expandable up to 64 gigs of storage, and 2 gigabytes of RAM to go with it. It was powered by Snapdragon's chip of 2012, which was the Snapdragon S4. It also had a 13 megapixel camera on the back, which had a video output of up to 1080p. The front-facing camera didn't have any video at all at the time. And at the time, you were able to purchase these kinds of phones for $200 on a contract with any of the 4 major carriers. The next phone that LG would come out with would be known as the LG G2. They dropped the Optimus branding in favor of just a plain old G, so hence the LG G2. However, this phone came with 16 gigabytes of onboard storage and 2 gigabytes of RAM. It had a removable back to access the battery, and also they moved the buttons, the power and volume buttons, to the back of the phone, which was a very bold move at the time, and LG was all about boldness as they would continue to experiment with different things over the years. The camera system that they used at the time was the same camera system that they used in the LG Optimus G. However, they introduced video recording in the LG G2 on the front-facing camera. Later that year, LG decided to release a phone that would sorta, I guess, compete with the Galaxy Note, considering that it was the second phone that they would release. They would release the LG G Flex. Now, this was the first curved screen that we would see, along with phones at the time like the Samsung Galaxy Round, and it would sort of pave the way for what we would see today, here in 2021. It had a removable back to access the battery, and it was powered by the Snapdragon 800 at the time. It came with 32 gigabytes of onboard storage and 2 gigabytes of RAM, and a similar camera system to the LG G2. LG's next phone would be this phone right here, the LG G3. This had 32 gigs of onboard storage, 3 gigabytes of RAM, and was powered by the Snapdragon 801 at the time. And now the camera had a 13 megapixel sensor in it. It also had laser autofocus, which was what this was right here. So if you were taking a picture of somebody and they saw that red light go on, that's what that was. That was the laser autofocus working. And it was pretty good at the time. Now, as you could see here, I don't have the LG G3 battery because it expanded. However, I'm showing you this to show that you can remove the LG G3's battery, and this was at a time when removable batteries were still a thing. Oh, and the battery it came with was a 3000 milliamp hour battery. So now it's the year of 2015. It's CES of 2015, and LG is present there with a new phone that they developed. It is the LG G Flex 2. And it was powered by the Snapdragon 810, which had a ton of overheating problems, which is why Samsung decided not to put the Snapdragon 810 into their Galaxy S6 that year. Its screen that it had was a 1080p panel, and it was flexible, of course. Also, it had 3 gigabytes of RAM, 16 gigabytes of onboard storage, and a 13 megapixel rear camera and a 2 megapixel front-facing camera as well. Now onto the LG G4. The LG G4 was a very important phone for LG because this was LG's chance to bounce back after having all those overheating problems that the LG G Flex 2 had. However, the LG G4 had problems of its own. This is where the boot loops officially started to come into play with LG, and this is where LG really had its problems with customers. So what is a boot loop, you might ask? Well, a boot loop is kind of when a device sort of locks up and it'll automatically restart itself, and phone manufacturers intentionally put that in there so that this way devices can keep running smoothly and the software could just shut itself off whenever it has a freeze for too long of a period of time during the day. However, LG's problem was that it was a hardware component problem, and this resulted in a class action lawsuit that came into play around 2018-2019 with phones such as the LG G5, which also had boot loop problems as well, and the Nexus 5X, which had its boot loop problems. And sometimes the phone wouldn't even turn on at all. However, one thing LG did bring to the G4 was the leather back that was also removable. It came with 32 gigabytes of onboard storage, 3 gigabytes of RAM, and a 16 megapixel rear camera and 8 megapixel front-facing camera as well. Now, one thing this phone did have was a subtle flex to it, and this allowed for better handling of the phone. Now, LG decided to introduce a new line and completely forego the LG Flex line. This is where LG started with the creator-friendly V line, starting off with the LG V10. This phone introduced what is called a second display, where you could put a slogan, you could put your name, you could put apps, you could put your media controls up there, etc., etc. It too, like the G4, had its boot loop problems. However, LG upgraded the storage from the LG G4 into the V10 from 32 gigabytes to 64 gigabytes, as well as the RAM from 3 gigabytes to 4 gigabytes. It had a 16 megapixel rear camera and a 5 megapixel front-facing camera. It was one of the first phones to have its fingerprint sensor on the back of the phone. The next year, LG decided to go modular. They decided to introduce the phone known as the LG G5. This was the fifth phone in the LG G line, and the way the mods worked was that you had to take out the entire battery in order to replace the mods. I mean, on paper, the mods were a good idea. It was around the time that Project Aura was a thing, and Google was trying to experiment with modular phones where you could replace parts kind of like you can with a PC. But however, it didn't work. The LG mods, you had to take out the entire battery, meaning that you had to turn the phone off to replace them. It just ultimately did not work, and ultimately they stopped with the mods thing. It also introduced us to phones having wide camera sensors, meaning that phones would now have not one sensor on the back, but two sensors. So basically, the one sensor was the main sensor on the back, and you also had a wide-angle sensor on the LG G5. It had the Snapdragon 820's 32 gigabytes of onboard storage and 4 gigabytes of RAM. It had a 16 megapixel rear camera and an 8 megapixel front-facing camera. It was also the first phone that was not a Nexus to have the USB Type-C on the back. Next up would be the phone that would come out later that year, and that would be the LG V20. The LG V20 would be the first phone to launch with Android 7.0 Nougat. And the reason why I bring this up is because it would be the first phone to do so before the Google phones, which would be known as the Pixels at the time. LG kept the removable battery at the time when the market was moving away from removable batteries and moving towards all glass designs. It had 64 gigabytes of onboard storage, 4 gigs of RAM, and kept the similar camera system to the LG G5. Then the next year we saw what is known as the LG G6. Now what was interesting about the LG G6 was that when everyone was upgrading to 64 gigabytes of onboard storage, LG stuck with 32 gigabytes for some reason. LG decided to remove away from its experimental side just to regain the trust of its customers. It came with the Snapdragon 821, and the reason why it came with the Snapdragon 821 was simply because they had a deal with Samsung where I guess Samsung was supposed to be the first to release the Snapdragon 835 in their phones. So LG was not allowed to do that. So LG went with the Snapdragon 821. They put 32 gigabytes of onboard storage in their phone when everyone else was putting in 64, and they stuck with 4 gigs of RAM as well. And now let's discuss the LG V30. The LG V30 was a little bit confusing with their brand name. Why? Because this is where LG decided to come out with phones like the LG V30. Yes, the LG V35, the LG V35 GS, whatever, the LG V30 Plus. You name it, they came out with it. The main model in this line had a Snapdragon 835, 64 gigabytes of onboard storage, 4 gigs of RAM, a 16 megapixel rear camera, and a 5 megapixel front-facing camera as well. With this phone, LG decided to remove its removable battery, and it also removed its second display as well. Next up is the LG G7 Thinq Q. Or is it Thank You? I don't know, but anyway, this would be the next phone in LG's G line, as they would attempt a rebranding in hopes that they would start making a profit again. The G7 Thinq Q would have a 16 megapixel ultra-wide and standard camera on the back, and an 8 megapixel front-facing camera as well. They went with 64 gigabytes of onboard storage and went with 4 gigabytes of RAM in their phones, and also had the Snapdragon 845 chip processor as well. They went with similar branding with the LG V40. It was also known as the LG V40 Thinq Q. Now the V40 was one of those phones that had a bunch of cameras. It had a grand total of 5 cameras. You had 3 of them on the back and 2 of them on the front. On the back it had a 12 megapixel telephoto lens, 12 megapixel standard lens, and a 16 megapixel ultra wide lens as well. The front camera, one was standard, one was an ultra wide. The ultra wide had 5 megapixels on it, and the standard had 8 megapixels on it as well. The storage was 64 gigabytes of onboard storage, and it also had 6 gigabytes of RAM, and it used the Snapdragon 845 to power it. And now on to the LG G8 Thinq Q. This would be the last of the LG G line that we would see. This phone came out in the year of 2019. It had either 4 or 5 cameras in total depending upon your region. 2 of the lenses on the back had 12 megapixels on them, and one of them had 16 megapixels. The 12 megapixel lenses were the standard one and the telephoto lens, while the 16 megapixel one was the ultra-wide camera on the back. The front-facing camera was an 8 megapixel camera, and it also had a time-of-flight sensor as well. They upgraded the storage from 64 gigabytes to 128 gigabytes. It had 6 gigabytes of RAM and was powered by the Snapdragon 855 as well. The next phone in their lineup would be the LG V50. Now, what's interesting about this device was that it was literally announced at the same time that the LG G8 was announced. If you really notice anything here with the past couple phones that I mentioned, there was nothing really special about them. LG was trying to stick to the basics and trying to regain the customer's trust. On the back, they went with a 12 megapixel telephoto lens, 16 megapixel ultra-wide lens. The front cameras were 8 megapixels and 5 megapixels as they decided to go with the dual sensor. The LG V50 had a Snapdragon 855 in it, 128 gigabytes of onboard storage, and 6 gigabytes of RAM in it. Next, let's talk about the LG Velvet for a minute. Now, the LG Velvet was an interesting device because this time they decided to go with the Snapdragon 765G instead of the Snapdragon 865, which was the Snapdragon of that year. The camera got a huge bump though. 48 megapixels was the standard camera on that phone, along with an 8 megapixel ultra-wide camera and a 5 megapixel depth sensor. It also had a 16 megapixel front-facing camera as well. LG also stuck with putting in 128 gigabytes of internal storage on their phones and also putting in 6 gigabytes of RAM. Also note that this was LG's first 5G device. However, the LG Velvet was not their flagship phone for that year. The flagship phone that year was the LG V60 because the LG V60 was the one that came with the Snapdragon 865 in it. The V60 had 3 sensors. It had a 64 megapixel standard sensor, a 13 megapixel ultra-wide sensor, and a 0.5 time of flight sensor as well. Front camera was a 10 megapixel camera, and this would be the last that we would see from LG as far as the LG V line is concerned. But of course, depending upon region, you either got a 128 gigabyte phone with 6 gigs of RAM, or you got 256 gigabytes with 8 gigabytes of RAM. And now finally, the LG Wing. Now the LG Wing was a very interesting device. It had 2 screens on it. It was a dual screen display, and what you could do with the top screen is that you could flip it out and make it sideways, and it was like the T-Mobile Sidekick from back in the day. The phone allowed you to do was it allowed you to do one thing on the regular screen that you had, the screen that you held up and down, while on the top screen it allowed you to do something else. The front-facing camera was a pop-up camera. It was a 32 megapixel camera, and it was a very similar camera system to what OnePlus did, and I believe it was the OnePlus 7 that they did the pop-up camera. But anyway, it was a pop-up camera similar to that phone. The main sensor on the back was a 64 megapixel sensor, and you had 2 ultra-wide sensors coming in at 13 megapixels and 12 megapixels as well. You either got 128 gigabytes or 256 gigabytes of onboard storage depending upon your region. Both of them had 8 gigabytes of RAM in them. Now on to the Nexus devices. The Nexus devices were Google's vision for what Android should be, and LG worked with Google 3 times to release 3 LG Nexus devices, starting off with the Nexus 4, then the Nexus 5 in 2013, and then the Nexus 5X in 2015. The Nexus 4 had a glossy back. It came with 8 or 16 gigabytes of onboard storage and had 1 gigabyte of RAM. The camera was an 8 megapixel camera on the rear, and the front-facing camera was a 1.3 megapixel camera. Then Google tapped LG again to make the Nexus 5, and the Nexus 5 came with 16 or 32 gigabytes of storage and had 2 gigabytes of RAM. It had the same exact camera system that the Nexus 4 had, which was an 8 megapixel rear camera and a 1.3 megapixel front-facing camera. Then fast forward to 2015, where Google decided to work with LG and Huawei to make their Nexus devices. LG made the Nexus 5X. The Nexus 5X had either 16 gigabytes or 32 gigabytes of onboard storage and 3 gigabytes of RAM. It had a 12 megapixel rear sensor and a 5 megapixel front-facing sensor as well. It launched with the Snapdragon 808. That covers all of LG's main Android devices, their flagship devices. Where does LG go from here? Well, as far as we know, they're going to focus more on what is making them profitable, which is IoT, which is appliances, and all of that other stuff. So, I mean, they're going to continue to produce your TVs, they're going to continue to produce your washers, your dryers, your appliances, whatever. But will they make another smartphone? As of right now, the answer is no. They will not be making another smartphone. But LG has committed to 3 years of updates with their most recent phones, and that's a good thing for LG. My one question, however, is will LG continue to produce LG tones? As you know, I love these LG tones. These are the earbuds that I use on a daily basis to listen to my podcasts, listen to YouTube videos, listen to music, etc., and to work out in as well. And I hope that they continue to produce these, because these are just amazing in the world of true wireless earbuds, which tend to fall out easily. These you just put around your neck and you know where your earbuds are and you can pull them out. But anyway, that's it for me. Hope you enjoyed this video. Follow me on Twitch. I will leave that link down below. Join the Discord server where we could talk about Android and we could talk about technology or whatever. And also be sure to follow me on Twitter as well. I will leave all links down below. And also subscribe and press that notification bell so that this way you know when I post to YouTube. See ya. Bye-bye.